The ontological argument for God's existence is an a priori argument, as Bonjour and Baker point out in their annotations. Here again, this Latin term a priori means independent of experience, or not drawn from experience. We said that the cosmological argument and the teleological argument for God's existence are a posteriori arguments. Again, this Latin term a posteriori means drawn from experience, or taken from experience, or supported by experience, or depending on experience, something like that. Because they, as we saw, begin from a certain observation. In the case of the argument from motion, it begins from the observation that there is motion. In the case of the argument from efficient causation, it begins from the observation that there are efficient causes. In the case of the argument from contingency, it begins from the observation that the things in the world are contingent. In the case of the teleological argument, it begins from the observation that there are, or there seem to be, purposes in the natural world. So those are all a posteriori arguments in that they begin from some truth of experience, some truth of observation. By way of contrast, the ontological argument is a priori. It doesn't proceed from any observation or any truth of experience. It proceeds from purely logical analysis of the concept of God. So the argument goes back to the 11th century philosopher Saint Anselm, Benedictine monk and Archbishop of Canterbury. That's the Anselm's presentation is the classic version of the argument, although it's been revised many times since then. It's always had a kind of appeal to many philosophers for reasons that we'll talk about going forward. We'll take a look at Anselm's classic presentation of the argument, and then we'll take a look at our selections from Descartes, a somewhat different presentation of the argument, but the same basic idea. And then we'll take a look at the criticisms of the argument made by the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. To paraphrase our selection from St. Anselm, the way that I would put the argument would be this, two premises, and then the conclusion. The first premise being the concept of God is a concept of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. So there I'm following Anselm's language pretty closely. That's the way that he oftentimes explains the concept of God. It's the concept of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Premise 2, a being that I can conceive, but that does not exist, is not as great as a being that I can conceive and that exists. Therefore, God exists. Okay, so let's think about the logic of the argument here. It's a conceptual truth, Anselm is saying, that something that possesses all perfections, and that an entity would have to possess all perfections in order to satisfy the definition that he lays down in premise 1, right? Something that had all perfections except the perfection of existence would not be the being than which nothing greater can be conceived, because then in that case there would be a being greater than the being conceived, namely the being that possesses all the same perfections as well as the perfection of existence. If something only possesses an attribute potentially, then it doesn't possess that attribute, it doesn't possess that property in the fullest sense. So an acorn, for example, is potentially an oak tree, but which is the perfect which is, let's put it this way, which is the greater oak tree, the one of two oak trees, of two things, let me put it that way, which is the greater oak tree? The one that is a fully realized, flourishing oak tree with roots and branches and leaves, or the acorn, which is potentially an oak tree? Which of those two is the greater oak tree? The one that has the nature of an oak tree in it, in a latent way, in an implicit way, but that nature has yet to be fully realized, or the entity that has already fully realized that nature? Which of the two things is the greater thing of that kind? That's the sense in which Anselm understands existence as a kind of perfection, as a kind of, we might say, completion or kind of realization of some potentiality. But in the case of God, as we've seen, the concept is, among other things, the concept of an eternal being. And so it's a being that never went from potentially something to actually something, to go back to the importance of this Aristotelian distinction that we talked about, the distinction between potentiality and actuality. God is a unique case, metaphysically speaking, or here again, at least our concept of God is the concept of an entity that would be a unique case, metaphysically speaking. It would be an entity that never went from potentiality to actuality. An eternal being that already has always, from all time, fully realized its essence, fully realized all of its essential attributes. So that's what the concept of God is in the Western philosophical tradition. And Anselm is saying here that it's a kind of conceptual truth that that entity must exist, right? Because once you have that definition in hand, then there are, logically speaking, there would seem to be only two possibilities. The being conceived of in that definition has all perfections except existence, or the being conceived of in that definition has all perfections including the perfection of existence. So, given those two logically possible entities, which of them satisfies the definition? Well, the first one, the one that lacks a perfection, that lacks existence, cannot be the one that satisfies the definition laid down in premise 1, can it? Because then if that entity were God, it would fail here again, hypothetically speaking, the definition would fail because there would be a being greater than that being, namely the being that possesses all perfections, including the perfection of existence. So the basic idea is that it's a kind of conceptual truth that God exists. Once you grasp the definition, once you grasp the concept, you understand that existence belongs in an essential way to that being, the being expressed in that definition, the being expressed by that concept. You take away, what I mean by a property being essential to something is that you take away that property and you're no longer talking about the same kind of thing. So being a mammal, for example, is an essential property of being a horse. You take away that property and you're no longer talking about the same thing. Say, for example, take away from a triangle the property of being three-sided, being a three-sided figure, three-sided plane figure, and you're no longer talking about the same thing. That's an essential property of being a triangle. And then there are properties that are not essential. Obviously, that's true of many things in the world. A tall woman was the same person before she was tall, say, for example. So you take away that attribute, it's not an essential property, not an essential attribute, in that you could be talking about the same person even before she was tall. So some properties, some attributes are essential, some are merely accidental, to use a metaphysical term. this distinction is oftentimes drawn in metaphysics between essence and accident. An essential property here again is you take away that property and you're no longer talking about the same thing. That wouldn't be the case with respect to accidental properties. So, in the classic presentation of the argument, it's seen as a kind of conceptual truth that God exists. Once you grasp the definition, once you grasp the concept and understand everything that it entails, you understand that God's existence is logically entailed by the concept. So this is an a priori argument. It proceeds strictly just from purely logical analysis of the concept of God. It doesn't depend on any truth of observation, any truth of experience. Well, I said a moment ago, the argument has always had a certain appeal to philosophers. There have been many versions of it, but it's also met with much skepticism among many philosophers at the same time, even in Anselm's own time. So another Benedictine monk by the name of Ganillo, also an 11th century Benedictine monk, although not in England like Anselm, but in France, Ganillo of Tours, wrote a reply to Anselm's argument in which he said, in so many words, you could say that about anything. You could reason that way about anything, and by dint of this notion that it's a kind of conceptual truth that something exists, you could just bring anything into existence. So Ganillo proposes a counterexample in his criticism of Anselm's argument. He says, look, here would be an argument of exactly the same form. You could reason this way, and this would be reasoning in exactly the same fashion as Anselm proposes here. Premise 1, I can conceive a supremely perfect island. Premise 2, an island that I can conceive, but that does not exist, would not be as perfect as an island that I can conceive and that exists. Therefore, conclusion, a supremely perfect island exists. Well, here again, the structure of the argument is exactly the same, isn't it? You could just say the same thing. It's a kind of conceptual truth, or a kind of truth of definition, that the perfect island would be the island that possesses all perfections. Which of two islands would be greater? One that has every perfection except existing, or, hypothetically speaking, one that has all perfections including existence. Only that second hypothetical island could satisfy the definition laid down in the first premise. Therefore, a perfect island exists, and so forth and so on. You can think of any number of examples. And that argument is of exactly the same kind, but we wouldn't accept that conclusion. Therefore, the argument can't be right. So the argument has always had a certain appeal, but it's always met with a certain amount of skepticism at the same time. And Ganillo's counterexample would be the first example in writing of a challenge to the basic logic of Anselm's argument. We have selections from Descartes in which he presents a slightly different version of the argument, but I think broadly the strategy is the same. The logic is much the same. As Bonjour and Baker point out in their annotations, this new version of the ontological argument in Descartes' Meditations is presented in terms of the property of aseity. That's the notion of the property of having the source of one's existence in oneself, having existence as an innate or an intrinsic property. So, in metaphysics, we oftentimes distinguish between intrinsic properties and relational properties. Some properties that you have are only relational. They only exist in virtue of your relations to other things. And then there are some properties that here again are intrinsic, inseparable from your nature. In the case of a human being, that you are a rational entity, that you are a rational being, is an intrinsic property. It's rooted in the very nature of human beings. They are beings with minds. They are beings with the faculty of reason, the power of reasoning, everything that comes with rationality. That's an intrinsic property of human beings. It's inseparable from what it is to be a human being. By way of contrast, if you're sitting to the left of the door right now, let's say, that's not an intrinsic property of you. It's a property that only exists in virtue of a relation between you and something else, namely you and the door. If you get up and walk out of the room and walk to the park or something, that property disappears, doesn't it? It wasn't really essential to you. It wasn't an intrinsic property of you. And Descartes was arguing that there's this property of having the source of existence within itself, this property of aseity, and that was the property that Descartes argues here again belongs to the concept of God. It's a kind of conceptual truth that God does not depend on anything else for his existence. Here again, in a way that's a little bit similar to what we saw in the argument from contingency, everything in this world depends on something else for its existence. You were brought into being by other human beings, they were brought into existence by their parents, and so forth, and so on, going back a long, long way, obviously. And all the other things that we see in the world around us, in the natural world, everything that we see in the universe was brought into being by something else, by events antecedent, physical processes antecedent to the thing that is brought into being. So even planets, even galaxies for that matter, were brought into existence out of earlier states of affairs. Nebulae, say for example, in the case of galaxies. Everything in the world depends on something else for its existence, in the sense of having been brought into existence. Of course, once it exists, then it has a kind of independence. But in the sense of coming into existence, everything depends on something else for its existence. But that's not true of the concept. It's kind of a conceptual truth that wouldn't be true of God, because here again, God is conceived as an eternal being. So by definition, an eternal being could not depend on something else for its existence. There was no time at which it came into existence. It's kind of conceptual truth that an eternal being never came into existence. So Descartes focuses on this kind of conceptual truth about our concept of God. Descartes writes, when I imagine, Descartes offers an analogy with conceptual truths about mathematical objects, geometrical objects, say for example. These are all objects of pure thought. And when you grasp the concept of this or that entity, you realize, if you really do grasp the concept, you understand that certain properties go along with this mathematical entity in a necessary way, in an essential way. Here again, you take away that property and you're no longer talking about the same thing. Descartes gives the example of a triangle. When I imagine a triangle, even if perhaps no such figure exists outside my thought anywhere in the world, and never has, the triangle still has a certain determinate nature, essence, or form, which is unchangeable and eternal, which I did not fabricate, and which does not depend on my mind. So, what would be an example? I mentioned that every triangle is a three-sided figure. Here again, this property would be unchangeable and eternal. This is an unchangeable and eternal property of triangles, to follow Descartes' way of putting the point here. And that is a truth about triangles that does not depend on the human mind. The human mind discovers certain mathematical entities and comes to understand their nature in thinking about them. But from the fact that human beings discover such entities, It's a kind of, here again, conceptual truth that such entities exist antecedent to the discovering mind. And when the mind discovers certain mathematical entities, it comes to understand that the entity in question has certain essential properties, unchangeable, eternal properties. Mathematical entities have a certain determinate nature, that is to say, a fully determined, a fixed nature. And mathematical entities have certain essential properties. It's an essential to the number 7 that it's prime. Take away that property, you're no longer talking about the same thing. It's essential to the number 7 that it's odd. Take away that property, you're no longer talking about the same thing. The number 7 has a certain determinate, unchangeable, eternal nature. I take it that it will always be true that 7 is prime. It will always be true that 7 is odd. These will be essential properties of the number 7, whether anybody exists to think about it or not. Descartes gives the example of having internal angles equal to 2 right angles. That is true of every triangle. And that is an example of a necessary property. The property of having internal angles equal to 2 right angles is a necessary property of triangles. This property is inseparable from what it is to be a triangle. So here again, sometimes in metaphysics we distinguish between necessary and contingent properties, which for our purposes comes to much the same point that I had in mind in distinguishing between intrinsic and relational properties, or intrinsic and accidental properties, or sometimes it's put in terms of essential and accidental properties. You may be tall, but it's not a necessary property of you that you are tall, because there was a time when you existed but were not tall. So that is not a necessary property of you. You may be to the left of the door, but that is not a necessary property of you. That property is separable from your nature. That could cease to be true. You could move to the right of the door and you would still be the same person. So being to the left of the door is not a necessary property of you. But there are necessary properties, certainly when it comes to mathematical entities like triangles. We know that they have certain essential attributes. And once you grasp the concept, you understand that that property necessarily goes with that kind of thing. So the property of having internal angles equal to 2 right angles, again, is a necessary property of triangles. You take away that property and you're no longer talking about the same thing. It's an essential attribute, a necessary property, different ways of saying the same thing. And here again, the analogy is with the concept of God. The concept of God is the concept of something that has certain attributes necessarily, including existence. But to say that God exists necessarily just amounts to saying that God exists. Or, let me put it this way, to say that existence is an essential property of God, as the ontological argument does say, just comes to the same thing as saying God exists, right? If I say existence is a necessary property of something, that's just another way of saying that thing exists. So it's kind of a conceptual truth that God exists, according to the ontological argument. Descartes argues that when one conceives clearly and distinctly of a triangle, one is necessarily conceiving of a figure that has this property, and to deny this property would be a contradiction. So it would be a contradiction for me to say, I believe in triangles, but I do not believe that there are any entities that have internal angles equal to 2 right angles. If I said that, I would be contradicting myself. And it's characteristic of the ontological argument. Its proponents have always argued that in a sense, to deny the existence of God entails a kind of contradiction. You're contradicting yourself because the concept of God is the concept of a being that has existence as a necessary attribute, as an essential property. But here again, to say that something has the property of existence essentially just is to say that it exists. So that's just in the nature of necessary properties. There are properties that are inseparable from the thing under discussion. And existence is not such a property for anything except God. It's a kind of unique case where it's a conceptual truth that existence is a necessary property by dint of the kind of content of the concept of God. So when one conceives clearly and distinctly of a triangle, one is necessarily conceiving of a figure that has this property of having angles equal to two right angles. To deny this property would be a contradiction. Similarly, the concept of God is of a being that has the property of existence necessarily. So to deny this would be a kind of contradiction. To say that the thought here is that to say I deny the existence of the necessarily existing being is a contradiction. So that's the basic gist of the ontological argument. To conceive of God is to conceive of a being from whom the property of existence is inseparable. Existence belongs to God's essence. Here again, there are properties of you that are inseparable from your nature as well, that you are a mammal, say for example, or that you are a rational being. That is just a part of what it is to be a human being, a being that has the potential to exercise the faculty of reason. Has reason at least in a latent way, at least in an implicit way. Although of course a human being can lose that faculty or never develop it in some cases. It's a kind of conceptual truth that a human being is an entity that has that property, at least in the sense of it being a latent property. That is just an essential attribute of human nature. But again, there are many properties that are separable from you. Being tall is separable from your essential nature. Being to the left of the door is separable from your essential nature. And then there's, here again, certain properties that are inseparable, and it's a kind of conceptual truth that existence is inseparable from God's essential nature. Descartes says, I cannot think of God except as existing. That is to say, to think of God as not existing is a kind of contradiction. That would be like trying to think of, according to Descartes, it would be like trying to think of a triangle that doesn't have three sides, or trying to think of a triangle that lacks this property of having angles equal to two right angles. I can't do it. Because once you grasp everything that is logically entailed by the concept, then you understand if you take away certain properties, you're no longer talking about the same thing. So I can't even conceive of a triangle that isn't a three-sided figure, say for example. I can't conceive of a number 7 that isn't odd, say for example. And similarly, I cannot conceive of God except as existing, Descartes argues, because once you understand everything that is entailed by the concept, then you understand that it would be a contradiction to try to think of the hypothetical entity under discussion here without thinking of it as existing. Existence is inseparable from God. That, here again, that just comes to the same thing as saying that God exists. All right, so as I've said, it's always had a certain appeal to philosophers, but at the same time, even in Anselm's own time, as we've seen, even from the beginning, was met with some skepticism among philosophers at the same time. Gaunillo of Tours, this 11th century Benedictine monk I mentioned who criticized Anselm, was a kind of empiricist. He believed that, we've touched on this epistemological position before, that empiricism is a broad epistemological principle to the effect that knowledge comes from experience, and that something exists can only be known on the basis of experience. But as we've seen, the ontological argument is an a priori argument. It doesn't appeal to any facts of experience. Now, Gaunilo of Tours did believe in God, but his view would just be that the ontological argument cannot establish the existence of God. Human reason cannot establish the existence of God. It has to be accepted on faith, and there might be good reasons for having faith, but reason itself cannot establish as a kind of conceptual truth that anything exists. So that's an old idea in philosophy as well, and it's been closely associated with this current in philosophy that came to be called over time the empiricist approach, or empiricism generally, the kind that we've seen in connection with Hume. Closely related criticism is further developed by the 18th century German philosopher Kant. Kant thought a lot about the nature of concepts, and one of his conclusions in thinking about them was that it can't ever be a conceptual truth that something exists. So in certain respects, his criticism here is a little bit like that of Gaunilo. It can't be established by reason that something exists. Reason doesn't tell us what exists. Now, here again, like Gaunilo, Kant did believe in God, but he did not believe that the ontological argument, or for that matter, any a priori argument, any argument based on pure reason, pure logical analysis of concepts, he didn't believe that any such argument could establish the existence of God. And for that matter, he didn't believe that any argument could establish the existence of God. He did believe in God, but thought that that belief had to be based on faith. It could never be a truth of reason. So Kant thought a lot about what he saw as the confusion involved in the ontological argument. He says that the argument rests on a confusion between, on the one hand, necessary judgments, which is a kind of epistemological issue. Whether we must judge that something is the case has to do with knowledge and belief. But whether something necessarily exists is a kind of metaphysical issue. And just because we must make a certain judgment given certain premises, it doesn't follow that anything necessarily exists. That's all. Whether what we're thinking about exists is always a kind of further question that can't be established by reason alone. Can't be established by pure reason. Experience has to contribute something, although Kant was not an empiricist. He didn't believe that all knowledge depends on experience. He did believe in a priori knowledge. He did not think it could be a truth of a priori knowledge that God exists. Or let me put it this way, he did not believe that a priori knowledge could establish that anything exists. A priori knowledge consists in certain kinds of knowledge that we have that does not depend on experience, but it really has to do with the form that knowledge takes. A priori truths really have to do with the necessary form that knowledge takes. It's never an a priori truth that something exists. Kant understands that there are many necessary judgments, but here again, it's never a necessary judgment that anything exists. And because it's never, let me put it this way, it's never a necessary truth that anything exists. There are necessary truths, according to Kant, but whether something exists cannot be. The existential claims about existence, can't be necessary truths. And for that reason, denying the existence of anything, according to Kant, never results in a contradiction. So we saw Hume say that as well, right? We saw Hume and Kant are quite different philosophers in many respects, but interestingly enough, they would agree on that premise. There's never a contradiction involving the existence of anything, because it's never a necessary truth that anything exists. Existential statements about existence, are never necessary truths. There are necessary truths, but statements about existence do not fall under the domain of necessary truths. So what would be an example of a necessary judgment? here again, lots of examples that you can think of in math, right? Arithmetic, geometry. A triangle, for example, is a figure with internal angles equal to 2 right angles. That's a necessary judgment, a necessary truth. Once you understand the nature of that basic geometric form, you understand that here again, property goes with that subject necessarily. And a contradiction does result if we deny the predicate but retain the subject. So in this case, the predicate would be, is a figure with internal angles equal to 2 right angles. So there would be a contradiction in saying, I believe that there are such things as triangles, but I do not believe there are figures with internal angles equal to 2 right angles. If I were to say that, then I would be stating a kind of contradiction. I would be contradicting myself. And it's, as I said a moment ago, it's an old idea at the root of the ontological argument that denying the existence of God involves a kind of contradiction. But that is what Kant is denying. And we've seen Hume deny that as well. No contradiction, Kant points out that no contradiction results if we deny the predicate and the subject, no matter what the predicate may be. So if I say, I do not believe in triangles, and I do not believe there are any three-sided figures, or I do not believe there are any figures with internal angles equal to 2 right angles. Now, I haven't contradicted myself. There's no contradiction involved in saying that. There's only a contradiction if you assert the subject and then deny some property that necessarily attaches to that subject. Then a contradiction results. But there's no contradiction in denying both. That's Kant's point. There's no contradiction in saying, I do not judge, or I do not believe there are triangles, and I do not believe there are three-sided figures. Now I've not contradicted myself. As a matter of fact, I may be wrong. It may be false that there are no triangles. But I haven't contradicted myself. I've simply, in that case, made a false statement, but not a contradictory statement. And here again, the ontological argument has always tried to establish the existence of God by contending that there's a kind of contradiction involved in denying the existence of God. But Kant's point is that that's not true. Yes, it's a conceptual truth that God is a being that has the property of existence essentially. But there's no contradiction if someone says, I don't believe in God, and I don't believe that there is any entity that has the property of existence essentially. There's no contradiction in that statement. Yes, there would be a contradiction if someone said, I believe in God, but I do not believe there is any being that has the property of existence essentially. That would be a kind of contradiction. But Kant's point is there's no contradiction if you deny both the subject and the predicate. So the only way to avoid the conclusion that any predicate can be denied without logical contradiction is to contend that there is some absolutely necessary subject. But Kant's point is that that would beg the question. That would assume the conclusion that the ontological argument is supposed to establish. So there's no contradiction in denying any particular predicate, so long as you also are willing to deny the subject. And that's the kind of confusion, as Kant sees it, that the ontological argument historically has overlooked. Kant says, I cannot form the least concept of a thing which, should it be rejected with all its predicates, leaves behind a contradiction. So here again, there are many conceptual truths. It's a conceptual truth, say for example, that all whales are mammals. And so if I say I believe in whales but I don't believe in mammals, yes, I've committed a kind of contradiction, because it is a conceptual truth that all whales are mammals. But if I say I don't believe in whales and I don't believe in mammals, I haven't committed any contradiction. I've said something that's false, but I haven't committed any contradiction. I haven't stated any contradiction. One way that Kant puts the point in our selections is to say that the ontological argument rests on a confusion of logical predicates with real predicates. So as I said a moment ago, Kant thought a lot about the nature of concepts and the way that the subject of a sentence oftentimes expresses some concept, and the predicate oftentimes expresses some property of that subject. But not every grammatical predicate is necessarily a logical predicate in the same way. So when it comes to sugar exists, the verb is the predicate of that sentence. Sugar is the subject, but that predicate doesn't add anything to the concept of sugar. The logical predicate is not a real predicate, to use Kant's way of putting this point. The logical predicate is not a predicate that adds anything to the concept of sugar. You might already have a complete concept of sugar, a concept of it that correctly conceives of all its essential properties. But it's always a further question whether that exists. Here again, you might have a complete concept of a unicorn as well. But to say that unicorns exist doesn't add anything to the concept of unicorn. The concept is a concept of a horse with a horn growing out of its head. Once you've grasped that concept, you have everything that is entailed in the concept or contained in the concept. To say that that entity, to then say that that entity exists doesn't add anything to the concept unicorn. It's still the same concept. By way of contrast, a real predicate, to use Kant's terminology here, adds conceptual content, adds content to the concept. So sugar is soluble, for example. In the case of the predicate of that sentence is soluble, that adds something to the content of sugar. Maybe you didn't know that. Maybe you had an incomplete, an imperfect concept of sugar. You understood that it was a white, crystalline substance that is sweet, but maybe you didn't know that it was soluble. Maybe you didn't know that if you put it in water, it'll dissolve. So in being told that, the predicate adds something to your concept. The real predicate, soluble, adds conceptual content to the concept of sugar. So there's a difference between logical predicates and real predicates. Again, to say that something exists is a merely logical predicate. It doesn't add anything to the concept of sugar. Is soluble is a real predicate. It adds something to a certain concept. Kant draws a rigorous distinction between the concept on the one hand and the object that the concept is of on the other hand. If we say, Kant writes, God is, we attach no new predicate to the concept of God, but only posit the subject in itself with all its predicates, and indeed posit it as being an object that stands in relation to my concept. So Kant's point is that it's never a conceptual truth that the object expressed by the concept or the object under discussion in the concept, it's never a conceptual truth that object exists. It's never a conceptual truth that the concept tracks some object or that the object, let me put it this way, it's never a conceptual truth that any concept is instantiated. That is to say, that there's an instance of the entity conceived of in the concept. The concept itself can never establish that. It's always a further question whether there is any object that falls under a concept. So I have a concept of a whale, but simply in virtue of having the concept, it can't follow that there is any object that falls under that concept, because I also have the concept of a unicorn, but there isn't any object that falls under that concept. So it's never a conceptual truth that there is an object that corresponds to the concept. No object of a concept is given absolutely, Kant says. The concept expresses merely what is possible. So it's never the case, Kant is arguing here, that a concept can express something necessary. Statements can express necessary truths. But here again, as we've seen, statements express necessary truths by saying that if you posit the concept, then necessarily you posit the concept expressed in the subject as having certain properties, essentially or necessarily. But that's different from, here again, that the statement expresses a kind of necessary connection between subject and predicate. That's different from a concept expressing what is necessary. Concepts only express what is possible. That was Kant's view, and that is how they're treated in modern logic, as a result of Kant's thinking about concepts. In some ways, modern logic, the predicate logic that comes in the 19th century as a result of the work of another German philosopher, the 19th century German philosopher Frege, who invented modern logic and was very much influenced by Kant. That is the way the concepts are thought of in modern logic, which is quite different from how they were thought about in the 11th century when Anselm is writing in the old traditional Aristotelian logic. It was thought that, well, let me put it this way, concepts were thought of quite differently. This rigorous distinction between concept and object is much more sharply delineated in modern philosophy of language and modern logic. And concepts are understood as merely expressing what is possible. One way that Kant puts the point is to say that the content of the concept and the content of the object are the same. So here again, it's never a conceptual truth that there isn't any object that falls under a concept. We have to distinguish sharply between the concept and the argument. But if an object does fall under some concept, then everything that is true of the object will of course be true of what is expressed in the concept. So Kant gives the example: the concept of $100 is the concept of as many dollars as are in 100 real dollars. So if I have 100 real dollars, then I have let's say in my pocket, then I have as many dollars in my pocket as are expressed in the concept of $100. As a matter of fact, I don't have 100 actual dollars or real dollars in my pocket. I only have 100 conceptual dollars. And unfortunately, I've found that 100 conceptual dollars does not go very far. That an object belongs to a concept is synthetic and not an analytic truth, Kant goes on to say. He draws this distinction between analytic and synthetic statements. Analytic statements are statements in which the predicate is contained in the subject. So an example of an analytic statement would be all bachelors are unmarried. The subject term there, bachelor, means unmarried man. So of course the predicate term unmarried is contained in a latent way, in an implicit way. The predicate unmarried is contained in the subject, bachelor. That would be an example of an analytic statement. It would be an example where the predicate is implicit in the subject. Sometimes the predicate is explicitly in the subject. Say, for example, all tall men are tall. In that case, the predicate tall is explicitly in the subject, tall men. So both of those would be examples of analytic statements, statements in which the predicate is contained in the subject, either in an explicit way or in an implicit way. By way of contrast, in synthetic statements, the predicate is not contained in the subject. Say, for example, sugar is soluble. It's not a conceptual truth. It's a discovery that sugar is soluble. Presumably, one could already have a concept of the substance before one further goes on to discover that it's soluble. So the concept predicate is not, the predicate soluble, is not contained in the concept sugar. Pickles are divisible. Here again, that's a truth about pickles. You can divide them, you can slice them up, but that's a synthetic truth. That's not an analytic truth. Divisible is not part of the concept of pickle. And so what would be another example? Something like the cat is on the mat. That might well be true, but if that statement is true in a given context of utterance, that's a kind of synthetic truth. The concept, the predicate is on the mat is not in the concept cat, right? If that statement is true, it's a kind of synthetic truth. It's not true in virtue of the definition of a cat. It's not true. It's not a kind of conceptual truth in virtue of the predicate being contained in the concept cat. So our concepts track objects, Kant goes on to observe. And he makes a subtle observation about the way that we use concepts, the way that we use them to track objects, the way that we use them to express possibilities, and then try to determine whether there is anything in the world, any object in the world that falls under that concept. Namely, that if existence added anything to a concept, it wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be possible for us to use concepts the way that we do. The object, because the object would be something more than the object, than the object tracked by our concept. So we use concepts to express possibilities. Think of the role of concepts in science, right? There was a time when it wasn't known whether black holes exist. Initially, they were just theoretical entities that were posited to explain certain phenomena. But whether there were any objects that fall under the concept black hole was a further question. It had to be established. There was a time in the history of science when it wasn't known whether electrons exist. Here again, initially that was a conceptual entity introduced to explain certain phenomena, and then whether they exist was a further question that had to be verified. So that's the way the concepts work. We use them to express possibilities, but it's always a further concept whether there is any object that falls under that concept. It's always a further question whether that concept is instantiated, to use another metaphysical term. That is to say, it's always a further issue. It can never be a truth of reason or a purely logical truth or a purely conceptual truth, that there is an instance of the world, an instance in the world of the possibility expressed by the concept. The concept itself can never establish that. Kant says, we do not make the least addition to the thing when we further declare that this thing is. Otherwise, it would not be exactly the same thing that exists, but something more than we had thought in the concept. As I said, the argument has always had a certain appeal to philosophers. The 20th century British philosopher Bertrand Russell put the point like this: is there anything we can think of which, by the mere fact that we can think of it, is shown to exist outside our thought? Every philosopher would like to say yes, because a philosopher's job is to find out things about the world by thinking rather than observing. So that's Russell's way of explaining the long-standing appeal that the ontological argument has had in Western philosophy. Philosophy is not a natural science. It's not an empirical branch of knowledge. It's a branch of knowledge that proceeds by logical analysis of concepts. So, of course, the ontological argument, which proceeds purely from logical analysis of the concept of God, is always going to have a certain appeal in philosophy. And that's Russell's way of explaining the appeal that it has had. I guess there's no reason that I had to add this picture of Russell on this slide. I just like that picture. Cranky old guy. One way that Russell put the point is to say that the verb to be, or to exist, or the predicate is real, exists generally. It only expresses the claim that a concept is instantiated, but it can never be a conceptual truth that a concept is instantiated, that there is an instance in the world of the possibility expressed by that concept. That can never itself be a conceptual truth. It's logically the function of the verb to be or to exist. Logically, the function of exist is to assert that there is an instance in the world of the concept used in the subject. So that is the way that claims about existence are treated in modern logic. Russell, along with this 19th century German philosopher Frege, who was very much influenced by Kant, had a lot to do with the history of modern logic. And in modern logic, conceptual truths are expressed as conditional statements. By way of contrast, claims about existence are expressed as particular statements. So that's the way that this issue of existence is treated in modern logic. So logically, the function of exist is to assert that there is an instance in the world of the concept used in the subject. A conceptual truth would be expressed as a kind of conditional statement. Say, for example, all whales are mammals. That's a kind of conceptual truth. And in modern logic, it would be expressed as a conditional statement. It would be, if we were to use a quantifier, a variable, it would be expressed as, for any x, if x is a whale, then x is a mammal. That's a kind of conditional claim. But that claim doesn't say that there are any whales. And that's in the nature of conceptual truths as they are treated in modern logic. A conditional statement doesn't say that the thing under discussion exists. So here again, all whales are mammals is a conceptual truth. But in modern logic, that statement is treated as a statement of the form here again, for every x. If x is a whale, then x is a mammal. But that statement doesn't say that there are any whales. So that's how conceptual truths are handled in modern logic without committing any claim about existence, without committing to the further claim that the thing under discussion in the concept exists. By way of contrast, claims about existence are treated in modern logic as particular statements. In the case of a statement like unicorns do not exist, in modern logic that would be treated, Russell says, that should be understood as there are no x's such that x is a unicorn is true. So statements about existence can either be treated as particular statements, such as there exists an x such that x is a unicorn, or they can be treated as, in this case, the negation of a universal statement. Do not exist can be understood as the conditional statement is false. But that's a claim about the truth value of the conditional statement. Here again, the conditional statement itself didn't say that the thing under discussion exists. So unicorns do not exist should be understood as there are no x's such that the statement x is a unicorn is true. So that's another way that claims about existence are treated in modern logic. If existence is being denied to something, that amounts to the assertion that the conceptual truth is not true, or is not, here again, the concept under discussion in the conceptual truth is not instantiated. There aren't any instances of that concept. There are no x's such that x is a unicorn is a true statement. That would be the way of treating claims about existence in modern logic. So, as I've been saying, in modern logic there is this much sharper delineation between the concept and the object on the one hand, and concepts are treated always as expressing only possibilities. It's always a further question whether there is any object that instantiates the concept, or whether there is any object that falls under the concept. Concepts in modern philosophy of language and modern logic are treated as merely expressing possibilities.